So we're back with lesson 2, part 2. So we've created our project we're going to work with. We've customized the homepage a little bit, and we've uploaded it to GitHub. We've also included a link to the source code here in our footer. So what we want to do is we're going to make our own controller. Last week we worked with the existing home controller, but we're going to make our own controller. So we want to make a controller for the categories of food in our online grocery shop. We're probably going to wind up deleting this controller in a few weeks, but we're going to work with it for now. So in your Solution Explorer, if you right-click your controllers folder, we're going to choose Add Controller. Now we're going to get a few different options. We have an empty controller, we have a controller with read-write actions, or a controller with views using Entity Framework. We'll use this option in a few weeks, and you'll use this option in your assignment, but for today, we just want an empty controller. So it's going to create a class, but there's not really going to be anything in it. So again, right-click your controllers folder, choose Add Controller, pick MVC Controller Empty, and click the Add button. And it'll bring up this screen. And what we want to call this file is we're going to call it categoriescontroller.cs. Whoops, sorry, didn't mean to hit enter that quickly, but there's your name. And I'm using Pascal case, so a few things to note about how our controllers are named. Number one is we use Pascal case. Right-click controllers, click Add Controller, pick MVC Controller Empty, click the Add button, and call it categoriescontroller.cs. So the controller names are always plural. We use plural nouns. It's not category singular. It's categories plural. And I've used Pascal case, so both words start with a capital letter. So we'll get a base controller. That's okay. It happens. Sometimes computers are slow or something happens. No problem. It inherits from the MVC base controller class, and we automatically get an index method. So we could go to back to our browser now and try and browse to the index method of our categories. So if I go back here, I could just append on to the end of my URL /categories. What's going to happen when I hit enter and go to load our categories index? What result do you expect? Okay, empty page, could we get an error? Error, why? It is going to be an error. What error is going to happen? Right, it's not exactly a not found, it's not a 404, it's that there is no view. Exactly. So the URL, the method gets called in the controller, but then it crashes because it's looking for a view called index in the categories subfolder. And that view isn't here. So I could actually run this. I've been using the start without debugging, but we could actually try the debugger, and we could watch this. So in my controller, if I click beside line 11 or beside line 12, I could actually start my debugger and watch the code execute. So this time I'm going to click Start Debugging. So this would be similar to what you did in your C# course, right? With Windows Forms, you can do the runtime debugging. So it's actually going to start my server again. And now if I go to /categories, I can watch the C# code execute at runtime. So my code's active here. To advance one line at a time, I hit F11. So now line 13 is going to execute. So my index method gets called. And when it goes to return the view, so the C# code ends. And then finally, the page tries to load in the browser and fails because we don't have this view. Now, my debugger is active here. You can see I've got this diagnostic running showing how much memory my page is using. But I can't actually make any changes to the code, or I can't save changes while it's active. So I'm going to stop my debugger. I can remove my breakpoint. So how do we fix the error? What do we have to do in order for this to work? So our controller method works, but we don't have the view. So what's the easiest way to create the view that we're missing? Yeah, we could do a try catch, but I just want to create the view. So I can right-click my method name, like we did last week. Yep, so we could do it that way as well, Marwa. We could go to Solution Explorer, and under here we could, but I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to add a view that's empty. I'm going to call it index. So I'm just going to leave the name that comes up because it matches my method name. And when I click add, notice Visual Studio automatically now created a categories subfolder under views. And here's our new view. Yep. So it's great that we didn't have to create the folder. It created the folder for us. Now we've got some server-side tags at the top that we don't need. We'll just put some HTML on here. We'll say choose a category. And for now, we're just going to hard code a few items in here. I'll just use an unordered list. And I'll just maybe put on, just make some fake categories. Once we use a database in a few weeks, we'll make real ones, but for today, this will do. So a really simple page with an unordered list, a bulleted list of 3 items. Now I'll try to reload my page. Yeah, it does support Emmet. Visual Studio should support Emmet. Oh, you know what? There's an extension. Okay, Amar, can you explain what Emmet is? I'll show you how to install Emmet. I'm sure some people are familiar with it, some people probably are not. What is Emmet? It does have support, we just have to enable it. I have Emmet in mine. Yeah, it's basically shorthand. So if I want to do, you know, like h1 dot my class and hit tab, thought I enabled it. Oh, maybe I had it and disabled it. Here's how you can get Emmet. So under your extensions window, if you go to manage extensions, if you search here for Emmet, hang on just a second. I thought I had it installed already. Bear with me. There is one, but I'm not sure if this is the extension we want or not. Let me just check it out. Right. It is here. That's weird. Why doesn't it show up? Here's the link. To install it though, so you'd have to download it first. So I'm going to open with the Visual Studio launcher. And I'm going to have to close and reopen Visual Studio. So I'm going to say, yes, I want to install this in Visual Studio. This is totally optional, but for those of you who like Emmet, you're going to want it. So I'm going to end my tasks. It's going to close Visual Studio and install the Emmet extension for me. I don't use Emmet nearly as much as I should. It does save us a lot of time when we're coding HTML, for sure. Yep, it's optional. So I'm going to reopen my project now. Yeah, Deep, that's exactly right. So now I can just click on my project, reopen it. So I'll go back to my categories index. So if I want to do something like, now I can hit tab and the Emmet syntax generates my tags. So you just have to install the extension and restart Visual Studio if you want it. Yep. Totally optional if you don't use it. You certainly don't have to. Which instructor showed you Emmet? Was it Scott last year or somebody else? Yep, VS Code does come with Emmet. Now, good point, Jesse. Because I've closed and reopened the project, I've got to start without debugging again, right? So my server is off. My page still is open in the browser from before, but the server's offline, can't connect. So I will just start without debugging again. To restart IIS Express, okay, how to test. Do something like this. Just type H1 and hit tab. If it's installed, it will generate the closing tag and the angled brackets. Or you could do something like key dot, my class and hit it. See if it generates the HTML. Okay, good. So now my categories page should work. So now when we go to localhost / categories, it calls the index method in our new controller. And our little bulleted list shows up. Now we're going to do a little bit more with this. We also want to make these into links. So I'm going to put an anchor tag around each category name. One of the other cool things in Visual Studio, notice now my formatting is a little bit wonky, right? I've got the opening LI tag here, but I've got the closing LI tag down over here. This is functional, it will work. If I refresh. However, my code formatting is now kind of hard to read. So Visual Studio has a neat tool. If I just hit Control A, or I could just highlight either everything or use my mouse to highlight a particular section. If I right-click and choose Format Selection, notice what it does. It nicely aligns the closing tag underneath the opening tag, so my code becomes more readable. So I'm going to, instead of using an href attribute on my anchor tag, I'm going to use the ASP attributes we used last week. So my ASP controller is going to be categories, and my ASP action is going to be browse. So this method doesn't exist yet, but we're going to create it in a minute in our categories controller. So I'll save that change. If I go back to the browser, my category 1 should now be made into a link. Categories 2 and 3 still just show as standard text, but I should be able to click on category 1 now. Just check it and see. So you notice now category 1 is a link, it's blue. I get the cursor effect. I get the cursor when I roll the mouse over it. Now, when I click it, I get a blank page because this method doesn't exist yet. So I want to do the same thing with category 2 and category 3. I want all of these to be clickable. So again, I'll do our controller as categories, and our action is browse. And I'm going to copy this same link tag and wrap it around category 3. And again, I will reformat my selection so all of my tags are indented and nested. I'll right click. I'm going to choose the format selection. What's going on here? I don't think this is right. I don't think I'm missing a bracket. Yeah, it fixed itself. So here's my code. So it's just standard HTML, but we're using the ASP controller and ASP action. So all 3 of these are now links. And I can click on any one of them. So this is, it's functional, but not sort of fully functional. Hopefully that completes soon. You may just need to restart Visual Studio. So what else do we need to do with these links? I'd suggest there's a couple other things we need to do to kind of complete this functionality. So what's missing? The page looks okay. Yeah. So Marvel, what are we going to need to do in terms of browse specifically? You're right. So we need to do 2 or 3 things with browse. Because right now we click the links and we just get this. Yeah, we're going to need to create the method or action called browse. Yep. And then what are we going to need to do once we create that method in our new controller? You got it. We'll need to create the view as well. So let's do that. And then there's going to be a third step we're going to want to add. So let's go back to the categories controller. And let's create put in a comment. So this will be categories / browse. So we'll make a new method that returns an iAction result. We're going to call it browse. And we need 1 line of code inside this method. What does the method do? What should we type on line 19? Should be pretty simple. You got it, Jesse. We are going to return a view. So if we run this now, instead of the blank screen we were getting, we're going to get the same error we had earlier. We've got a method called browse now, but there is no view. So we're going to need the view as well, as both Alex and Palhua have suggested. My links are now clickable, but there's now the need to create browse.cshtml. So this will be simple. This will be easy, just like creating our index view. So our shortcut is right-click the browse method. We'll choose add a view. It's going to be an empty view. And we will call it browse.cshtml. And Visual Studio is automatically going to put this in the categories folder. So if we look in Solution Explorer, we've now got our browse view. And just for now, we'll just put on a brief message that says, you are browsing. We'll just put on a message here. So nothing complicated. We've created a new method that returns a view, and we have this new kind of static view. So this makes our error go away. Yep. So here's the new method in the controller. A new method called browse. The method returns an iAction result. And we're returning the view. And then we just use Visual Studio to add the view with the same name. So this is working now. We don't get a white screen. We don't get an error saying there's no view. But there's one piece of functionality that's still kind of missing. What's wrong with this? It works, but there's something else we should do. Yeah, it's right, Jesse. That doesn't matter what link we click, we get the exact same thing. And yes, Yulia, a good point. We can't access it as well. So let's deal with, yeah, all the links are the same. So let's deal with both of these. Okay, where would we go? How would we add a link to this so that you could get here? What page would we modify if we want to add a link to get to the list of categories? Yeah, we'd add it to the layout. So let's go to the layout file first. And just like we did last week, in fact, I think what we'll do, we don't really need a link to privacy in the header. We don't typically see that, right? We've already got a link to the privacy policy in the footer, and that's where people expect to see it. So instead of adding a categories link here, let's just change the existing privacy link we already have that's in the header on line 25. So what changes should we make here on line 25? We want to change this link. So instead of loading the privacy page, yeah, let's change both the text of the link to categories. We're going to change the action. What should the action be? Which method should this link call? Thanks, Tilla. It's going to call index, but instead of the index in the home controller, which will load the site homepage, we want it to load the index method of the categories controller. So we have two different index methods now in the project. The home controller has one that loads the home page, and the categories controller has its own index method. So we've now modified these things on line 25 of our layout file. So Yulia, thanks for the suggestion, good idea. So now we've got home and categories. So the other thing we need to do is when we're loading the browse page, yes, I agree, it's so much cleaner to have this kind of separation of our logic, our views, and it will be easier when we get into working with data and models, which we will kind of do a little bit in a simplified way today. So our last step here is we want to make it so that when you click on a link, this page shows which category, shows the name of the category you picked. Right now, clicking here, we get the same thing. So we no longer know what information, what category the user wanted. So we want to add something here to our browse method. So I'm going to go back to the categories controller, and we're going to add a parameter here. So we want this page to show which category the user clicked on. So we're going to add an input parameter to the browse method. What data type should we use for that parameter? Okay, if we were using a database, yes, we might use an int, but for today, we'll just make it a string. And we'll call that parameter category. So we're going to store the input parameter in a variable inside the view bag so we can display the user's selection. So we used this view bag container last week. I'll just define a variable called category, and we'll set it equal to the input parameter. Okay, so the browse method now accepts a string, and we're going to take that string, put it in the view bag in a variable with the same name, and that way we can render this variable on the browse page. So I'll leave the code up for a minute, and then we're going to want to modify the browse view so that we can also output this variable. So now our page, instead of just saying you are browsing, it will say you are browsing category 1 or category 2 or category 3. Okay, so we've added the string parameter. We then take that parameter value and stick it in a view bag variable. So we're going to have to do 2 more things to complete this functionality. Here, normally we probably would pass an integer, but we don't have any integer value because we're not working with the database today. So right now there's no integer value attached to these categories. There will be once we'll need to do that as well, Attila. So I'm going to go back to the browse. And under here, I'll add an H2. And I'll use the view bag dot category. So we're going to set this variable in the controller method, but we're going to display it on the browse page. So there'll be 2 HTML heading tags. H1 will say you are browsing, and H2 will then have the actual name of the category, 1, 2, or 3. So let's try this out, see what happens. So I'll click on categories. I'll choose category 2, and I got nothing. Just says you're browsing. Choose category 3, nothing. Choose category 1, nothing. So what we've done so far is correct, but we're missing the step that Attila is mentioning. If we go back to our index method, you'll notice all our links are still identical. So we need to add the parameter to each one. So we've used ASP controller and ASP action. We looked at these last week. We looked at them. We've used them today. We're going to add a third ASP parameter. We're going to use ASP root. And then I'm going to create a variable called category, because this matches the input parameter that we've defined here. So I'll say root category equals category 1. I'm going to add the same root parameter to my other 2 links, ASP root and this should give us the functionality we're looking for. So now whenever we click one of these links, each link will call the browse method of the categories controller, but now we're going to be populating that input parameter, that string parameter we created. So yes, it would be possible to just pass in 1, 2, or 3 and make it an integer. We could. That would work as well. So now if I click category 2, it shows me category 2. So we can see we've now got this category parameter in the URL. So each link is calling the same method, but passing in a different input value. And then we're translating that input value and passing it along to the next view so that we can display it. Now, this is a bit of a contrived example. Normally, we're not going to hard code these things. Normally, we're going to have the categories living in a database. We're going to query the database and display them in a loop. We'll do that in a few weeks. We're not going to work with the database until lesson 4. I will push this example up to GitHub so you can reference it. I'll say lesson 2, part 2. Word code category list. Select. So I'll commit and push. So if you missed anything, you need to reference any of the code. It's now been updated in my global grub repository here on GitHub. Anybody have any questions so far about what we've done with the categories controller and the views? So in your assignment 2, when you start building your project, the controllers that you build will depend on what subject you chose for your application. So somebody said they were doing a car exhibit. So you're probably going to have a cars controller, for example. So everybody's controller files will look different depending on what the subject for your project is. Yeah, ASP root defines any input parameters to the method. So our browse method has an input parameter called category. So ASP root is populating that value. So at runtime, here, at runtime, notice the URL. It uses that ASP root value here as a key value pair. So here's the key name and here's the key value. So that ASP root gets translated to HTML this way at runtime. So it's the equivalent. If we view the source of the page, you can see what the links look like here. So that ASP controller, ASP action, ASP root, they get translated into a regular href tag at runtime. Manjinder, we don't use multiple controllers in one request. Each request is handled by a single controller. Yes. So Yulia, we will do that later on in the course. We will look at, yeah, that's fine. The %20 just represents, we could HTML encode it, just represents a space. So we can control within an individual controller, we can restrict access at the class level, for example, and say, for example, somebody has to be logged in or part in a certain user role in order to access any of the methods in the class, or we could restrict access at a method level. So we may have some methods with one access level and other methods with a different access level. So we'll do that. We'll start implementing those kind of authentication rules in lesson 6. It's very easy to do. Much, much easier in ASP.NET than it is in PHP. You can do it basically with one line of code. And we can declare either at the class level or at the individual method level. It's very simple. And we will do that. Excellent question. Yes, it is easier than in PHP, for sure. So we're not going to work, as I said, we're not going to work with our database for a couple of weeks, but I do want to, we are going to redo this page. This was kind of version 1, where we hard-coded all the HTML here. So in this version, we've worked now with the controllers and views for a couple of weeks. I'm going to introduce a really simple example of where we're also going to include a model. So we're going to go ahead and create a category model, and then we're going to rewrite this code. Instead of hard coding the categories here, we're going to generate a bunch of category objects in the model and include the model in the process. So our data actually comes from our model class rather than being hard coded in the HTML. So let's go to our Solution Explorer. We have this models folder here. We're going to create a category model. So the model represents the data. If you remember from last week, we go and look at our MVC diagram, which is in the week 1 folder, right? We talked last week about this pattern. Model represents the data, the views represent the user interface, and the controller is the logic that goes in between, right? The controller does all the messaging, all of the communication. Yeah, you know what? That video, I should hide it. Unfortunately, it's been made private. Thanks, Shisato. I'll have to hide that link. It was a third-party YouTube video. I thought it was a good little overview of MVC, but unfortunately, the link users made that video private. So let's make a model class. We've got this models folder here. So making a model in ASP.NET is really similar to how you would make a model in Java, how you would make a class. So I'm going to right-click models. I'm going to choose add. And there isn't a particular template for a model like there's a controller. I'm just going to add a class. This is just going to add a kind of generic C# object. But I want it to go in the models folder. So again, right-click models, choose add a class. Our class names should always be singular, just like they are in Java, and they should always start with a capital letter. So I'm going to call it category with a Y on the end. You can add the .cs extension, but it's there by default. So it's not necessary to type .cs. You can type category.cs, or you can just type category. It doesn't matter. I'm always in favor of less typing rather than more. If you don't have that option, if you don't see add class, then instead you can choose add new item, and then under Visual C#, class should be up here at the top. And again, you just call it category. So this is going in the models folder. I'll click add, and I just get a generic C# class. So we want to define a couple of properties. What properties should we have for a category class in an online store? Yeah, I think ID and name are pretty simple. So we'll define an int. Now, the names are important in .NET MVC. Every model, there's really only 2 acceptable naming conventions for a primary key. You can either use ID, or you can use the name of the model and then ID in Pascal case, one or the other. So I'll just make a note here. So all PK fields in ASP.NET MVC should be called either the model and then ID or just ID. So if you use this, then Visual Studio, it automatically knows this is a primary key field. And then we just define a get and set method. Jesse, it can, but it's not recommended. Because one of the things we're going to see in a few weeks is that Visual Studio has a tool that allows us to automatically build a database from our model classes. So if we define 8 model classes in our application, we can use a tool called the migration, where it will actually connect to an empty database and build 8 tables that map exactly. But the expectation is that those ID columns are auto-incrementing fields where the IDs are generated automatically by the database. So the best practice is to make those integers. And then we'll have a public string called name, again with a get and set. And the property names should be in Pascal case. You know, from your Java, your objects course, you may be in the habit of naming these in camel case, where you start them with a lowercase. In the .NET world, our classes and all properties should be using Pascal case. Property names. Okay, so there's our simple model. We could add other properties here, like a photo, for example, a date created. We'll just keep this simple, just a primary key, an ID, and a name, I think is all we need. So create this category file inside of your models folder. And now we should be able to use this model and interact with it in our controller to actually make, rather than hard coding in the HTML, just some fake links, we can actually use this model to generate category objects in memory. And then we can pass those objects to the controller and send them to the view. So we'll want to follow this whole kind of MVC pattern from last week, that the controller will generate a list of models, and then we can render the view and also pass that list to the view so we can display it. Okay. It's 12:51, so I'm going to make a new commit. So lesson 2, 3, so we're going to create category model. I'll push this up to GitHub. It's 10:1, so let's take 10 minutes here. And when we come back, we're going to integrate this model into our controller. And then we'll replace this hard-coded list with the dynamic list of categories that's coming from our controller and model. And then I'll also give you your brief kind of lab learning activity, which will only take you a few minutes to do for a couple of marks. I'll be sure to go over that before we wrap up for today. Okay, let's take 10 minutes here. Okay, all the code, if you're a bit behind, all the code is on GitHub. So you can now go to my repository and you can check your code with mine. And I will be recording I am recording the videos, and I will be uploading after class. So you will be able to rewatch anything we've done today.